Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, everyone. Please direct your attention to the screen.
What if we can't cure diabetes?
Or don't learn from our past?
What if we never treat each other as equals?
What if we can't make our city sustainable?
Or solve the climate crisis?
But what if we can?
Because together,
We have the potential,
To shape a different future.
a different future.
Welcome to UBC Connects. For today's event, we'll be using a web-based platform called Slido. It lets you ask questions in real time. It works on any mobile device, so take out yours and follow along. We'll show you how to get started. Although we do want you to use your device, please make sure it's on silent, as we don't want to interrupt the program. Now, once you've confirmed that your device is on silent, pull up your browser and go to slido.com. Now enter the event code UBC Connects. You'll see the hashtag symbol is already populated. All you need to do is enter UBC Connects, all one word. Now you're all set to submit your questions by clicking on the Ask button. Other people can like your question by giving it a thumbs up. When we get to the question and answer part of the program, our moderator will ask the top-rated questions first. You can start submitting questions, but they won't be visible until the moderator appears. At that point, you can start voting. Before you go, we have one more thing to ask. We'd like you to take out that mobile device one last time and go to the polling tab. That's where you'll see a few questions about your event experience. Please do take a moment. Your feedback matters to us. Enjoy the program.
Please welcome to the stage your MC for this event and a recent UBC graduate, Adriana Laurent.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adriana Laurent, and I'm a recent UBC graduate from the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, and one of the co-founders and the current projects administrators for the UBC Climate Hub. It is my absolute pleasure to be here tonight and to welcome everyone to UBC Connects. We're thrilled that you have joined us in the room as well as online for this event. In a few minutes, Santa J. Ono, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of British Columbia, will tell you more about the Connects series. But first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I think it's important to recognize the land we are on today and the people who have been on it for time immemorial. Since we're going to be discussing hidden truths and societal blind spots today, I want to take a moment to shed light on the dark and often hidden history on this land. For those of us who are settlers, we have a responsibility to learn this history and to understand how the impacts are still felt today. Tonight, we will hear a presentation from Ziya Tong, and I, for one, am thrilled. I had the pleasure of moderating an event earlier today for our UBC students, and I can tell you firsthand that Ziya is a very knowledgeable, engaging, and thoughtful speaker. When I was reading her book, I was constantly in awe of how thorough and articulate she was in her ability to explain some of the most complex issues we face today. Following Ziya's presentation, tonight's moderator, Penny Daflos, will join her on stage. Penny Daflos has been a reporter for CTV News for more than a decade, bringing her trademark storytelling to a range of issues. Penny will moderate a conversation with our distinguished speaker and open a short Q&A with the audience after. Tonight's program is being live streamed for folks who could not be with us tonight. Following the event, we will post an audio podcast as well as a selection of video clips on the event website at ubc.ca/ubcconnects. As you just saw, for the Q&A portion of the event, we will use an online engagement platform called Slido to include everyone in the conversation. Even those of you at home can participate. As a reminder, you can submit questions now and throughout Ziya's presentation, but we're going to hold off on posting the questions you submit for everyone to see until our moderator takes the stage. At this time, you'll be able to begin voting on all the submitted questions. If you would like to tweet during the program, please use @UBC and the hashtag UBCConnects. It is my pleasure to now tell you a bit about Professor Ono before I invite him on stage to say a few words and introduce our very special guest. Santa J. Ono is the 15th President and Vice Chancellor of the University of British Columbia. He earned his BA in Biological Sciences at the University of Chicago and his PhD in experimental medicine at McGill University. Before joining us at UBC, Santa held a variety of teaching, research, and administrative positions at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, University College London, Emory University, and finally at the University of Cincinnati, where he served as president from 2012 to 2016. Please join me in welcoming Santa J. Ono on the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you, Adriana, and thank you for your work on the Climate Hub. It's something that we are very proud of at UBC. I'd also like to welcome those of us joining us via live stream. We love to get the comments and participation from people far, far away in this UBC Connects series. UBC Connects is a public lecture series that features the esteemed thought leaders and focuses on pressing global issues. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize and thank some partners who have made this series possible. First, the R&J Stern Family Foundation for their generous support of this series. Our colleagues at Alumni UBC for their support. And lastly, the Georgia Strait, our media partner for this event. Thank you so much to Georgia Strait for their support of the series. I also want to let you know about the final speaker of this calendar year, and I'm very excited about it. On November 25th, we will welcome Nobel Prize winner Donna Strickland at the Chan Center for the Performing Arts, and I hope that you'll join us. Tickets are still available on ubc.ca/UBC Connects. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ziya Tong. Ziya, as you heard, is a renowned science communicator. She anchored Daily Planet, Discovery Channel's flagship science program, until its final season in 2018. Ziya also hosted the CBC's Emmy-nominated series Z, PBS's national primetime series Wired Science, and worked as a correspondent for Nova Science Now on PBS. I am very proud to say that Ziya is a UBC alumnus, receiving her bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology. And she can talk to you about what it was like to walk from one side of campus all the way to the Museum of Anthropology. She also has a master's degree in communications from my alma mater at McGill University in Montreal. Today, Ziya will be discussing her recent book, The Reality Bubble, which you can actually get outside in the lobby after the talk, which was published earlier this year. It has earned praise from luminaries, including Naomi Klein and David Suzuki, who calls her book required reading for all who care about what we are doing to the planet. Tonight, Ziya will reveal a hidden world by taking us on a journey to examine some of humanity's biggest blind spots. As she says in the book, quote, "Now more than ever, we need to see clearly, because we are at a critical juncture in human history. Our species is locked on a deadly collision course, one that threatens to extinguish life on Earth. Unless we learn to recognize our blind spots, we are in great trouble." Friends, please join me in welcoming Ziya Tong to UBC Connects.
Thank you so very much, everybody. I want to thank President Ono for his kind introduction, and it's a true honor for me to be here at the invitation of my alma mater. And Vancouver, you are my hometown, so yeah, absolutely, thank you. Really, it is. Just brings me so much joy to be able to be here with you during this time of impending doom to see how we can begin to envision a better world. And really, that's what I think we need to do. We need to begin to see the world differently. And so that's what I talk about in my book, The Reality Bubble: Blind Spots, Hidden Truths, and the Dangerous Illusions That Shape Our World. And one of the first things that people often ask me is, what do I mean by a reality bubble? And I think all of us here in Vancouver are used to the idea of metaphorical bubbles, whether it's real estate bubbles or tech bubbles. Essentially, being in a bubble means you have a warped perception of reality. And one of the best definitions that I've heard is that being inside of a bubble, it essentially reflects the difference between inhabiting an inner fiction and a much larger, bigger picture reality. And if we're not paying attention to that big picture reality, sometimes it can crash its way in. So a central tenet of this book is that reality is not as real as we think it is. So what do I mean by that? Well, according to scientists, it is almost impossible for any of us to experience this reality that we are all supposedly experiencing right now. And that's because as human beings, we operate on a delay. We are made of meat flesh. Our eyes, our ears, and our noses. Essentially, it takes about 80 milliseconds for all the signals in the world to be translated, all that noise to be translated into signals for our brains. So if you were to just look up at that image right there, it takes about 13 milliseconds for your eyes, for the light to basically hit the back of your retina, for the electrochemical impulses to reach your visual cortex. All of that takes 13 milliseconds, which seems like an instant for all of us. But in fact, for our machines that we have created, that is an incredibly long period of time. And for traders who are operating on the stock market today, in fact, they can send a signal, a financial transaction, from Chicago to New Jersey, back to Chicago, in exactly 13 milliseconds, the amount of time it takes for you to see that image. But more than that, routinely now, we send our images and our information across the Atlantic in 60 milliseconds. So think about that for a moment. I can send a signal from New York to London, all the way back to New York, from Chicago to New Jersey, back to Chicago, and still have 7 milliseconds left before we, as human beings, can process the reality of this present moment. And so I like this quote, actually, by Sal Arnica. He wrote a book called Broken Markets, and it says, "By the time the ordinary investor sees a quote, it's like looking at a star that burned out 50,000 years ago." Now, we are limited when it comes to how we perceive time, but we are also limited when it comes to how we perceive space. And all of us here today in the Vancouver Playhouse, essentially, we are living in a dollhouse-sized world. This is all constructed to human size, our houses, our cars, our apartments, our malls. But here on Earth, we are actually giants. We are massive. We are larger than 95% of all animal species that are smaller than the human thumb. But at the same time, we're absolutely tiny. And this isn't a petri dish of bacteria, of course. This is little tiny human beings doing a little bit of swimming. And I know that for many of you, when you've had a chance to fly in a plane, only after about 2 or 3 minutes, if you look outside the window, you'll see that we emerge as these tiny specks. We become insects. And within another minute or so, we completely vanish from the landscape. Now, we are limited in how we are able to see, but today we have technology that allows us to see much farther away than our own eyes can perceive. And I think many of you will be very familiar with this image. It is not the Eye of Sauron. This is M87, which is a super massive black hole that is 50 million light years away. And this thing is huge. It is 6.6 billion times the mass of our sun, and yet we cannot see it. On the other end of the spectrum, there is the tiny. So I don't know if you guys can see what's happening right inside of those two electrodes, and for scale, they are 2 millimeters apart. And inside of that, what you're looking at is an atom, one of the very building blocks of our universe. And it's incredible because this is imagery that was created by a student at the University of Oxford who illuminated the strontium atom with a violet laser, which enables us to actually see these tiny, 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 tiny particles that make up our world. Now, there are machines that we can use to see these blind spots, to see these things that don't appear in our everyday, ordinary reality. But of course, there are biological machines, machines that have been around for millions of years, sharks in particular. I love these creatures because they've been around for longer than trees. And sharks can see a world, especially hammerhead sharks with their stalk-eyed vision. They see a world that looks a little bit like this. And yeah, this is from the Interactive Architecture Lab. They wanted to simulate what it would be like to see as a hammerhead shark. And what's incredible is hammerhead sharks not only see what's in front of them, they also see what's behind them. And they can also simultaneously see what is above them and what is below them. But one of the absolute superstars of the animal kingdom when it comes to vision is the dragonfly. And dragonflies have eyes that are the size of their heads. So if you had eyes like a dragonfly, they would basically cover your entire face. And they have these two compound eyes, each with 28,000 lenses. Now, human beings, we have 3 opsins. We have 3 light-sensitive proteins that allow us to see red, green, and blue wavelengths. And this allows us to mix about 1 million different colors. Well, dragonflies, some species, have 30 opsins. So they are able to imagine a palette, a whole universe of colors that we simply can't even imagine. But on top of that, dragonflies can see in ultraviolet, and they can also see polarized light. But one thing that they can do on top of that as well, because they are such badass little creatures, is they can see in slow motion. So dragonflies see like bullet time, like in The Matrix when Neo is slowing down those bullets. And the reason why is because we as human beings, we see about 50 frames per second, and dragonflies see about 300. So if you were going to a movie with a dragonfly, basically it would look like a slideshow. They would be seeing everything slide by slide, which makes sense because dragonflies are actually incredibly formidable hunters. They can actually capture about 95% of their prey. So that's some of the ways that we can see the world. And of course, human beings, I think many of us know, we see a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. What we call visible light is 0.0035% of the electromagnetic spectrum. And there's all these exotic colors that exist on either side. And if you're looking over here at the radio waves are massive. They're about the size of buildings. And then you go down to the microwaves that are about the size of a bumblebee. And then you can go all the way down to gamma rays, which are really tiny, about the size of atomic nuclei. So on either side of the visible spectrum, we have light that goes from violet into the ultraviolet. And then on the other side, we have the reds that move into the infrareds. And what's great is there are animals that are able to perceive these ranges that are invisible to the naked eye for us. So let's take a look at a couple of those. This is just a gorgeous image. I love it. It is by an artist named Craig Burrows. And this is the world in ultraviolet. And it's incredible because this is how bees see the world. And many flowers actually have these remarkable big bullseyes on them that we wouldn't see with the naked eye. And this is to frame where the nectar is so that the bee has a landing strip and knows exactly where to go. On the other end of that spectrum is the infrared. And snakes and vipers have pit organs in the front of their faces that allow them to perceive this range as heat. And what you're looking at here is a snake that has captured a mouse. And scientists actually did some studies, and they blindfolded the snakes, and they realized that the snakes were still accurately able to capture their prey. And that is because the snakes had a different way of seeing. The snakes can see heat. Again, with technology, we've been able to mimic some of this so that we can see things that our naked eyes cannot perceive. And I think many of you will be familiar with how the Massachusetts police actually captured the Boston bomber. He is right here underneath a tarp, and he's hidden in a backyard in a boat. And without this new way of seeing, he may not have been captured. So let's take a look.
That blurry, glowing white thing is Jahar Tsarnaev, the Boston bomber. What you're seeing is thermal video captured by the Massachusetts State Police. And Tsarnaev was potentially armed, so no one could get close. The police used a $700,000 infrared camera mounted on their chopper to confirm his location. Once they saw he was there, they were able to safely capture him. The specialty cameras, made by a company called FLIR, were instrumental in the operation.
Okay, so that's one way that we can mimic a range that animals can see that we cannot. And there's one story that I tell in my book about another way to see. And it's about a surfer named Mike Sturdivant who lives in Florida. And this is a picture of Fort Walton Beach, Florida. As you can see, it's absolutely gorgeous, beautiful white sands. Well, one day, a lot of the folks on the beach actually started to get sick, and Mike in particular started coughing up blood. And people around him started getting sores and lesions on their skin, and a lot of people started reporting blurry vision. But it didn't make any sense because, as you can see, the beach looked picture perfect. So what he did was he actually, one night, he had a UV lamp that he used to shine and look for petrol leaks on the back of his boat. And he took that UV lamp and he shone it on the beach the next night. And this is what he found. The beach was glowing an orange color. And so he and a geologist friend took samples of that glowing orange, and they tried to find out what it is. And what they discovered was, in fact, this was Corexit dispersant. This was the dispersant that had come down with the currents from the BP oil spill hundreds of kilometers away in the Gulf of Mexico. And dispersant, when it actually mixes in with oil, becomes 52 times more toxic. So this is the beginning of when we start to see that it's very important sometimes to see beyond the ranges of what is visible, because sometimes what is beyond the range of what is visible can be quite dangerous. So we've talked a little bit now about what we can't see that surrounds us. And I want to move now, because we are animals, into what sustains us. And this was a shower thought that I had that was part of the impetus for writing my book. And I sent out this tweet one morning, and it went a little bit viral. And it's the idea that in the 21st century, there are cameras absolutely everywhere. We know this with CCTVs, cameras on our phones, the whole bit. Except where our food comes from, where our energy comes from, and where our waste goes. And I thought that was something that really, really struck me, because how did we become the most powerful species on Earth when we don't even know how we survive? And I want you to keep that question in mind, because I'm going to return to it a little bit later. How did we become the most powerful species on Earth when we are blind to how we survive? But first, what I want to do is I want to look at how we are blind to our human life support system. And I'm going to start with food. So food, I'm the kind of person who gets overjoyed and tripped out whenever I'm holding fruit, whether it's mangosteens or bananas or, grapes or cucumbers or peppers. We have this whole cornucopia of incredible foods and fruits and vegetables. And they have so many colors and textures and flavors, and yet they have 4 essential ingredients. All of this comes from the sunshine, the rain, code, which is DNA, and dirt. Now, people don't really pay attention to dirt. Not many people spend a lot of time looking at dirt, but dirt is actually, of course, alive. And in fact, a single tablespoon of dirt has more microbes in it. Well, it has 1 billion microbes in it, but one handful of dirt, like what you're seeing there, contains more microbes than there are people on Earth. And dirt is incredibly precious. In fact, it takes about a century to create just 1 millimeter of healthy soil. So how do we begin to look at the health of our soil? Well, one way is to use a camera, and you can actually see those saprotrophs there, and those are pretty big, relatively speaking, animals. These are the little creatures that take death, decay, and rot and turn it into new life. But I was actually quite fascinated by a new way that Canadian scientists started seeing the health of our soil. And they were so effective at doing this that they actually were able to share their information with many people around the world. And that new technology is tidy-whities. It actually is. Tidy-whities are a really good way to examine soil health. And that is because they are made of basically cellulose, long chains of glucose molecules, and this is an absolute feast and a bonanza for the microbes that are living beneath the soil. So this is what happens when you bury underwear in the ground and let the microbes grow at it. So on the right here is what you're looking at is really healthy soil. This is awesome soil. This is where the microbes there's lots of microbes in there having a big feast. And then the fruit of the loom on the left is where things are not looking quite as healthy. And the health of our soil is, of course, critical to our survival, but we're starting to see that soil around the world is in jeopardy. Our soil is degrading for many different reasons: water and wind erosion, loss of vegetation, industrial agriculture, the rise of monocrop culture, excessive use, and even lack of use of fertilizers. And the reason why it's so important to look deeply at our soil is because today, 2/5 of the world's population is already suffering from degraded soil. And according to one UN scientist, if we do not start paying attention to the dirt at our feet, we may only have 60 harvests left. So it's critical that we start looking at our soil. Now, water, of course, is also crucial to our survival. All of you here in the audience, you are 60% water, you're big bags of water, essentially. And water, to me, is one of the most incredible things in the world. I know people get very excited when they see auctions at Sotheby's because you're looking at things that are really quite ancient being auctioned off. But this is amazing stuff. I mean, basically what I have in my hands right now, we take it for granted, but it is billions of years old. The water that is in my hands has always been here on Earth, and the water that is in my hands is older, scientists tell us, than the sun. And what is incredible is that water is also a shapeshifter. This water has been a cloud. This water has been an iceberg. And this water has been at the bottom of the sea before it becomes a part of you and me. All of us are clouds and icebergs. It's actually really rather remarkable. So water, how do we begin to see water differently? Well, scientists are doing some really interesting work here, and that's because we have a tendency to think that, oh, you know, our water comes from rain, our drink water comes from rain, and it doesn't. Living off of rainwater is really like living off of your paycheck, whereas living off of groundwater and living off of the meltwater that comes from glaciers and ice, that is our actual savings account. So this is one of the ways that scientists have started looking at our water, and they're using spy satellites, which I love. So this is the Keyhole 9 spy satellite, and what they were able to do is they took a lot of the data that was finally declassified in order to start looking at what was happening in the Himalayas. Now, typically, I think many of you have seen those images of one person who's standing next to a glacier, and then they take a photo, and that glacier has sort of melted a little bit. Well, there's 650 glaciers in the Himalayan range, so how are you going to monitor all of those? And they decided, okay, let's take some of this imagery. And I want you to keep in mind, of course, this is in the 1970s, so it wasn't all digital photos. the film actually came down. They would jettison the film down in a little parachute, and then a C-190 plane would come along and intercept it. And so the scientists got a hold of that information, and they were able to stitch it together to give us a better view of what is happening in the glaciers today. And today, we are losing billions of tons of ice every year. In fact, we're losing about 3.2 million Olympic-sized swimming pools annually. And to reference Vancouver and British Columbia, our own glaciers here in BC, we are losing the equivalent of 22,000 Empire State Buildings worth of meltwater every single year. Now, from the snow caps, we're going to go now down underwater, and surprisingly, scientists are also using satellites. These are the GRACE satellites that they've been using. They travel, there's 2 of them, they're about 200 kilometers apart, and they monitor the differences in gravitational pull, and that's how they're able to chart the water that is underground and how much of it is being depleted. And today, according to the World Resources Institute, we are losing our groundwater at an alarming rate. In fact, 17 countries are home to extreme high water stress, and 44 countries, home to 1/3 of the world, are now facing deep groundwater distress. So it's critical that we begin to look at our water. Now, we talked a little bit about the food systems. I want to move now into our energy systems. And it was interesting to me because it was just Halloween here, of course, the other day. And you know, it's strange, right? Like, climate threat is like the scariest thing for all of us, and yet nobody ever dresses up as climate change. And the reason why nobody dresses up as climate change is because the threat is largely invisible, right? Where our energy comes from is invisible, and where it goes when it turns into those emissions that come out of our tailpipes and our buildings, a lot of that is invisible too. So in terms of where our energy comes from, we should be reminded that if we look past those gas pumps, we're actually pumping a prehistoric world into our gas tanks. And in fact, every single tank of gas contains 1,000 tons of prehistoric life. And if you were to actually do a calculation, as Tad Homer Dixon did, of the caloric value of that energy and that oil, 1 tank of gas is the equivalent of 2 years of human manual labor. So that kind of gives you a sense of why we are so addicted to oil and energy, because in a very real sense, it is power. So how do we begin to look at what happens to that energy once we burn it up? And of course, coal, this is an image of the Carboniferous 300 million years ago, and that is what makes up that form of energy as well. So when it burns up, these vapors, these carbon dioxide ghosts, enter the air. And I like this visualization. I know it looks like a static television set, but this is the work of Andy Lee Robinson. And you often hear people talk about parts per million of CO2. Well, on the right here, we have about 280 parts per million. That's exactly what we had around 1900s. And what we have here on the left is just over 400 parts per million. And that's the world that we live in today. And I think that this is just a very clear indication when people are trying to imagine what CO2 actually looks like. And it gives you a sense of the blanketing effect and why we are experiencing global warming. But there's another way to see CO2 as well, and that is to take a look at how it's impacting us in terms of scale. And I think some of the people who've done the best work with this is the folks at Carbon Visual. So I'm just going to share a small clip with you that they produced. that really kind of gives a sense of how much of this stuff we are pumping out there. And in terms of this particular film, one day's emissions is the equivalent of a pile that is 3.7 kilometers high and 7.4 kilometers across. But if we were to envision how much carbon dioxide we pump out globally, it would be the equivalent of 42 Mount Everests every single year. Now, this just gives you a sense of some of our food and energy systems. I want to look now in terms of waste. What are we not seeing there? And there's a tremendous amount of waste that we don't see that surrounds us. And in fact, our planet is the only one that looks like Pigpen in the solar system. What you're looking at is ESA, the European Space Agency's simulation, and it shows you that basically for debris that is less than a centimeter in size, we have about 170 million particles up there. And it's really, really quite dangerous, and sometimes people don't quite have a sense of why. But if you have a piece of debris that is only 1 centimeter in diameter going at orbital speed, it has the effect of a hand grenade. Now, there were some researchers who actually decided, who work in the aerospace industry, who wanted to simulate that. So they took 14 grams of plastic space debris, or plastic debris, basically what would be the equivalent of the end of a pencil, just the little eraser at the end of the pen. And they used a light gas gun at close quarters, and they shot it into a block of aluminum. So this is how damaging a tiny piece of space debris can be. That was the effect. But of course, we're not restricted to waste and garbage in space. We have a tremendous amount of waste here on Earth. And for most of us, we don't really pay attention to what we do with our garbage, do we? We kind of toss it into the bin, and it is out of sight and out of mind. But human beings, we are a trash-making species. We put out about 3 million metric tons of trash every 24 hours. And that number is expected to double in the next 5 years. And a lot of it ends up, of course, in landfill or in warehouses like these. But in poorer countries, they don't necessarily have those advantages or the techniques to keep everything hidden neatly away. And what you are looking at here is an actual river of trash in Guatemala, because sometimes all of this plastic, of course, and garbage and trash seeps right back into the atmosphere. Now, here in Canada, we export a lot of our recycled waste to places like Indonesia and the Philippines, and most recently China, until they began to turn it away. There's another reason, of course, that we can't see a lot of our garbage and our plastic and our waste, and that is because it is very, very tiny. Microplastics, I'm sure you have heard of. And recently, scientists went up to the Arctic, and they've realized that plastic is actually coming down with the snow. And they sampled the meltwater up there, the melted snow, and they found 10,000 plastic particles in every liter of water that they sampled. And so we know today that this plastic isn't just in the quote-unquote environment, because there is no place like the environment. It is everywhere around us, and it is entering into our own systems as well. Scientists have found plastic in fish, in mussels, in clams, in all forms of seafood. And in fact, most recently, a study was done on water that covered 12 countries on 5 continents. And they found that 83% of our tap water contains plastic. Needless to say, this is reverberating right up the food chain. And what you're looking at is a photo by Chris Jordan of an albatross mother that is feeding her chick plastic. So, this is the situation we find ourselves in today. I serve as the vice chair of WWF Canada, and every year we put out the Living Planet report. And the Earth has lost 52% of its vertebrate wildlife populations in the last 40 years. In my lifetime, we have lost half of the wildlife populations on Earth. At the same time, according to the United Nations, we have 11 years left to avert a catastrophic shift in climate that will affect all animals on Earth, including us. So you will notice that I'm not completely in despair here. I am still smiling, and there is a reason for that, and there is a reason why I'm not a proponent of doom and gloom, and rather I am a proponent of doom and bloom. So how do we begin to envision a better world, given the circumstances we face? I think one of the things that has to happen is when we have our eyes open, we must not hang them in despair. And I really like this quote by Noam Chomsky, because he says, there have been many gains over past years thanks to struggles undertaken under far harsher conditions than those we face today. And I am deeply and intimately aware of that when I look at my own grandfather's time, being alive during World War I and World War II. They were not living in a situation that was nearly catastrophic. They were living in a world that was totally catastrophic. We were talking about living in bombed out rubble and dealing with absolute starvation and loss and devastation everywhere. And yet, they were able to rebuild the world that all of us exist in today. So we already have a big leg up. This is something that kind of struck me recently as well, in terms of how we deal with facing some of these changes. And I was reminded of the Kubler-Ross change curve. And I think many of you have come across this before. People usually refer to it when they're dealing with facing loss and crisis and death. And one of the things that we go through is we go through a phase of shock and denial. We like to say that this isn't true before we get depressed and then move into phases of acceptance and integration. And I think it's obvious to many people, in fact, that there are people who are experiencing denial right now. These are people who are looking for evidence that climate change simply isn't true. And on the other hand, there are people who are at the bottom. They're depressed, and they simply don't know what to do. But what is fantastic, especially now in the world of science comm and working with a lot of different scientists, and I have to say this depression phase, everybody has to go through it, and it's actually healthy, because I don't think that people have an actual understanding of what is happening until they get a bit depressed about what is happening. But we can move through this now, and what's exciting is that there are people that are moving into experimentation, acceptance, and integration. So what does that look like? I have to say that the people that I've begun speaking with, especially in the world of science communication, are aware that solutions are not the problem. A lack of solutions. We have so many solutions, it's rather unbelievable. This is only a small group of solutions by the Project Drawdown. You can see that there's solutions in food, electricity generation, buildings and cities, land use, transport, as well as new solutions that are on the way. And as the host of Daily Planet on Discovery Channel, for a decade, we featured solutions on our show every single day. There are solutions everywhere, and they surround us like unclaimed lottery tickets. So these solutions, I'm going to show you now just a very, very brief glimpse at some leaders, some models in terms of cities, in terms of towns, and in terms of countries that are looking at things in a new way. And Sweden is one of those countries. They plan to ban fossil fuel cars by 2030, and it's enshrined in law that they will be net zero in terms of emissions by 2040. So one of the ways that they've been able to do this is they're actually seeing energy in a new way. So what they're doing at the train stations in Sweden is they harness human body heat. We emit about 100 watts. And so they can take this body heat and pump it to nearby buildings. So they've been incredibly creative. Kamikatsu is a town in Japan, and by next year, they will be net zero in terms of waste. And they're a fantastic model because they don't have landfills. They don't even have incinerators. What they are doing is they are looking back to their own history, because before the 1950s, basically valuing waste was such an important thing and such an important part of their culture. So this is from a local brewery, and as you can see, everything in that building is made from garbage and waste. Now, last but not least, in terms of these examples, is water. And what's incredible is in Windhoek, which is a population of about 300,000 in Namibia. And I think many of us know that Namibia is a desert. They have been able to transform their water by seeing the cycles of water that water basically goes through. And they take their sewage and they use microbes and they are able to process their water into drinking water. And Namibia has been doing this for 50 years. And they have not had a single waterborne illness in all of that time. So we have a lot of different solutions. And people say, where there's a will, there's a way. And what is fantastic today is that we also have the will. And I don't know how many of you are aware of a group called the Extinction Rebellion. They currently exist in 55 countries with 630 chapters. They are one movement, and their goal is to open people's eyes and to get out into the streets with direct action and help to continue to open other people's eyes. And I highly encourage everybody in the audience to learn more about the work that they are doing. You can go to rebellion.earth, because one of the first things they want governments to do is begin to tell the truth. We also have incredible momentum from our youth, and I think many of us are aware of this today. It's incredible because last month in September, just a little bit more than a month ago, 7 million people around the world, young people around the world, took part in climate marches. And of course, right here in Vancouver, this was just last week when Greta came to visit. So it is truly, truly remarkable that we have so much momentum. Now, when I was writing this book, I was struck by something that another Vancouverite said. And it is none other than the famed science fiction author, William Gibson. And he said that what scared him the most is that today, we barely ever hear young people talk about the 22nd century. He said that happens almost never. And I remember growing up, we used to party like it was 1999. We were always talking about the 21st century. And it is really time now for all of us to open our eyes and begin to imagine a 22nd century. Now, I want to return to a question that I asked earlier today, which is, how is it that we, as human beings, became the most powerful species on Earth when we are blind to how we survive? And it's interesting, because we have one way of seeing. We may not be able to see like bees can, or like eagles can, or like hammerhead sharks can, but we have one way to see that is different from any of the other 8.7 million animal species here on Earth. And it is the reason, as human beings, we have been able to build planes that allow us to travel at the speed of sound. And we have been able to build computer networks that allow us to communicate at the speed of light. And we have been able to send spacecraft 6 billion kilometers away and land with perfect precision on a distant comet. And it is because we, as human beings, can see with the mind's eye. What that means is that I can take an image of a reality that does not even exist in this world. And I can transmit that reality. We can share that image of that reality with one another. And that is what enables us to build a new world together. So up until now, this is what our big problem has been. We have been facing an invisible crisis. The apocalypse is an invisible beast. And that's why we have been at a loss when it comes to fighting it. But I would argue that today we have new ways to make it visible. And with a scientific lens, we can see what's happening. We can begin to see those blind spots. So today I just covered really only a few ways of seeing. There are so many more ways of seeing in the book. And we have perspective now. We have that historical perspective. We have solutions. We have momentum, and we have the ability to see with the mind's eye. And with that, I really believe we can do the seemingly impossible, because we are the only species that can imagine and build a new future. And in doing so, we are not subject to reality. We can change reality itself. Thank you very much.
Sorry for the delay. I didn't want to
Oh,
cut
no
you
problem.
off
We're
there.
all operating on a delay.
I'm just going to give Ziya a moment to catch her breath here because she's been talking for the last 40 minutes. And I could hear you talk all day. I'd be quite content to let you do that. But I just want to introduce myself. My name is Penny Daflos. I'm a reporter with CTV News. I'm on TV, I'm on Twitter, I'm online. I've also got a podcast, BTS with CTV, that tries to explore the hidden truths of journalism. So check that out if you have an interest in that. I'm a proud alumna of UBC as well, so I'm really happy to be here. And we're going to start with a few of my questions, but I still want to hear from you. So if you have been listening as intently as I have to the discussion so far and haven't gotten to Slido yet, please go ahead, submit your questions. I've got a tablet here ready to take that. And continue to send us your likes as well. If you don't have any questions that you can think of yourselves, please go ahead and upvote a few things. I've been looking forward to this for so long. So I'm going to be really honest. I think like a lot of people, I don't read a lot of nonfiction these days because there's just so much going on in the world that it is really easy to want to escape, whether it's watching Game of Thrones or reading escapist fiction and stuff. So I was really delighted to read this book, even though thinking about spider mites or whatever those creatures were crawling in and out of my pores was one of the moments in the book that I was like,
critters
oh my
that
God.
are having sex on your face right now.
Yeah, exactly. Like let's all visualize that for a moment. So stuff like that, it's it's almost like a buffet table of a book, and you get to sample all these beautiful facts because I was trying to explain to people what the book is about, and it's about everything. And I absolutely love that. But there's also a lot of stuff that I think is going to make people a little sick to their stomachs. Thinking about where our food comes from, thinking about the costs of the energy that we rely on every day. And so there's a lot of stuff that I think that we're aware of, but that we don't want to think about, the surveillance that happens every single day. So I guess my first question is, how did you pick a topic like this for a book that some people are not going to want to read? Some people are going to be like, I should read it, but I don't really want to face that. And was that intimidating? And did you feel you were taking a risk with a topic like this?
Yeah, basically, I could have written this book a long, long time ago if I decided to write a book about the environment, but I knew that nobody would read a book about the environment, and I wouldn't read a book about the environment. And people's eyes glaze over when you start thinking in that way. So the challenge, and the reason why it took a year to write, but it took 5 years to think about it. And it was trying to kind of look at reality and the world that we live in a different way. And there's a reason that the book has been compared to The Matrix, because essentially it's about this system that we live in. And everybody knows we talk about fighting the system, but very few people know what that system is. We know that we live in a world that we call the rat race. But I wanted to be able to chart from beginning to end why we're imprisoned in this system. Why are we trapped? Everybody knows that there are things that are wrong that are going on. Why do we keep doing it? And so that was really the impetus for the book. It certainly was a big challenge. And my family's here today, which is just really wonderful. And I made them suffer through it along with me. And so, yeah, it's one of those things that it is definitely a very big challenge. And I know that there are people, especially working in television, I know that, and I talked about this earlier today at UBC, people suffer from a lot of fatigue. And even if you put on a big show like Leonardo DiCaprio did, sometimes those environmental shows flop. And the reason why is because if you put on a show like that at 7 o'clock when people are coming home after being tired from the rat race, you know, the last thing they want to do is turn on the TV set and see something that is going to completely depress them. Which is why I decided to write a book that is quirky apocalyptic. And so I really wanted it to be a fun entryway into ways that we can rethink the world. And as you know, it's got a bit of a happy ending.
Well, and that was actually going to be my next question was, this book made me, it made me do a lot of Googling because there's so many, for those of you who've already read it, there's so many little stories and anecdotes that I wanted to know more. So there was a sense of wonder, there was a sense of curiosity, and there was also a sense that these problems are so big and they seem so insurmountable, and it's a mental and emotional roller coaster why did you do that to us? I feel like every time I open the book, I'm like, am I going to be happy? Am I going to be depressed? And you go through these cycles, actually, with every topic that you cover. Was that a strategy on your part?
I don't know that it was necessarily a strategy. Like, I was sitting there writing this book in bed, right? Like, this whole book was written in my bed. It was a little bit cold in the morning in Toronto. I had a desk. I thought I would be able to make my way over to actually do some writing. But I would just get up every morning. I was filming Daily Planet at the time. And I had a basic plan for how I was going to do this. And I knew I was going to have to take people to some treacherous places. And we are going to have to stare the abyss, and we're going to have to stare doom in the face. But there is a way to emerge outside of it.
In terms of kind of what to do about it, because obviously you've been living a lot of these facts and these realizations for a long time, how did it, as you did this research and began to open your eyes more, how did you change your own life? I mean, do you cycle everywhere? Do you eat, fruit? Like, are you a vegetarian? Like, I think people want to know, like, in terms of, because everyone I think who reads this book, it's going to have an impact on you. I've been thinking about so many things from it, just from page one. How has it affected you, like, as a person?
As a person, because I think what you'll see is there's 10 different blind spots, right? And we went through some of them today. So on the very first chapter, which is really about scale, and we only looked at the enormity, this idea that we are microscopic giants, I was enamored by stuff like growing grass. You know what I mean? Because I would see myself, I would know that even if I was sitting in a room that was empty by myself, I was surrounded by billions of living creatures that were invisible to the naked eye, right? So I was actually going through periods of deep enchantment with the world, recognizing the scale of everything that was around me, the billions of nuclear reactors that are invisible to the naked eye. So that part was really fun for me. In terms of looking at where our food comes from, I became quite aware also that, I write a little bit about disgustology and the science of disgust and the fact that people don't want to know where their food comes from. Nobody wants to know because it's gross, and it's better to kind of keep all of that knowledge away. But why do we think that way? And how dangerous is it for us to think this way when a lot of where our food comes from is no longer visible to the average person? When that food is sick and diseased, how dangerous is it that we're not actually looking at it? And being able to see those dangers, like we saw earlier with that beach that you can see in ultraviolet. Sure, it's not a great thing to know that that beach is actually covered in Corexit dispersant. But according to, actually, by law, a beach is considered clean if there's less than 1% oil slick that is on the cover. There was no oil there, and it becomes very, very crucial to be able to see dangerous things.
One of the top questions on Slido right now, so thank you everybody for participating and keep doing that. It's around the energy industry in Alberta. What do you think should be done? It's a huge national conversation right now, and we only have so much time, so we're going to need the Coles notes on this one. But what do you think can be done about our reliance on the tar sands? How can we do this in a way that's not going to destroy our economy? Do you see a way forward where we can do this? I mean, we were talking about it downstairs, without tearing apart the country. Do you see a way forward in terms of this really complex issue?
Well, I mean, there were so many people that moved to Alberta in order to get jobs when that oil boom happened. And there is such a potential right now for new jobs. And one of the things that I simply don't understand is why we're not, in terms of jobs, using that for retrofitting buildings. It is the number one thing that we have the technology to do. Emissions in Ontario, where I'm from, 17% of CO2 emissions come from buildings. We have plenty of buildings in the country, but more than that, Canada can actually be a model test country for the rest of technologies that are used in the world. And I think that what we really need now is political will. We need people to start employing these people. It's not that the information isn't out there. It's absolutely out there. We need to stop subsidizing old 19th, 18th century technologies and fuels and move into the 21st and the 22nd century. And any politician who is not doing that is leaving us behind.
For the people who are being personally affected, though, I think it can be scary. And so maybe there does need to be more discussion, more, so that it's not just, I think a lot of the concern is that it seems so theoretical, but these technologies are here.
Yeah, they're here. And I don't know if my friend Brennan Waters is here. He ran for the Green Party, but he's somebody who worked in Fort McMurray and then became somebody who now is trained in solar power and renewable energy. But again, a lot of the ways that we talk about energy is so boring, a lot of the times, I find. And so I'm more interested in the things that places like Sweden are doing. And one of the things that we mention in the book, or I mention in the book, is how they're so creative. Like, they run their bus fleets on human waste, slaughterhouse waste, and confiscated booze from the border. You know what I mean? Like, you can do things in a really interesting way. There is so much energy that is out there, and we need to think differently, and we need to see differently. So I think people, even I am a little bit Yawnsville when it's just a discussion about, you know, I'm not saying that wind power is not awesome, or wind and solar, but there are new ways to think about things. We have an entire grid that needs to be upgraded. Why isn't it being upgraded?
At one point in the book, you mentioned that a lot of scientific ideas that were radical at the time, that were dangerous at the time, we now accept them as fact, and sometimes it just is a matter of getting used to things. Do you think that we're at a point where we are starting to get used to things? It's not, you know, so revolutionary that these ideas of renewable energy, it may just be a matter of time for people to kind of digest that these options are out there, that maybe, you know, for all the protests and the discussion that we're having, it may be time that ultimately makes people really consider them?
Yeah, but I think that the time is running out on our reality bubble. And we're living in a bubble, and I think the biggest concern, just like in a real estate bubble, is everything is awesome when you're in the bubble. It looks great. Everything in Vancouver looks very safe and very cool. But pretty soon, the damage is going to be very, very, very difficult to ignore, which is why I'm so enchanted and thrilled by the young people who can see beyond the reality bubble today. These are people, and I think that there's a big reason for that. Young people have a different scientific education than most of us did when we were in school. I wasn't learning about climate change in school. That was not a part of my curricula. But every single student today is. So they have a very different reality. And the other wonderful thing is they are networked at the speed of light. So this gives me some hope that they're going to be able to communicate in a much faster way. And we're seeing that today all around the world, from Hong Kong to Libya, everywhere. People are rising and they are demanding change.
The flip side of that. I'm going to read you one of my favorite parts of the book. It's near the end. What we need urgently is a way out of this hall of mirrors. And we can find it with science, because science can shatter old worldviews. It can literally change the world by changing the way that we see it. And I love that, and I think that's so powerful. But at the same time, I think that a phrase that's entered our lexicon, and I despair of it ever leaving our lexicon again, is fake news.
Right.
And we're not just talking about disinformation and intentional manipulation that is spread out there as being news when it's not. We are talking about a phenomenon where somebody hears something they don't like, they disagree with, and they just dismiss it as fake news. And I mean, we live in an era when anti-vaxxers can dismiss facts as fake news. We live in an era where flat earthers, I can't believe I'm saying that, but like, you guys have probably seen it, they're out there and they legitimately believe it. And that's without even getting into the whole climate change debate, which I don't think that should be a debate. But I guess, how is it possible to reevaluate these big systems, to have a paradigm shift, to be able to do all these things that I think we need to do and you're advocating for, when there is a skepticism or a distrust of science?
Yeah, there certainly is. There's a huge problem with that, and part of the problem is, of course, that we only have one science show left in the country on TV, and that's my friend David Suzuki's show, The Nature of Things. And I think that, honestly, that is utterly shameful, because we don't have a way to communicate science very clearly, especially in terms of the mass media. So that is one thing. But I think that in terms of fake news, it is something that we've always had to battle. And the reason why I wanted to look at this notion of blind spots is, my hope is that when you can see something with your own eyes, just like Galileo looked up into the moon and everybody thought that it was this glowing, basically like, you know, this orb that had nothing on it. And when he actually could see with his own eyes that there were mountains and landscapes and landforms that looked like what we had on Earth, it's very difficult to argue when you can actually see the truth. And that's what I think we need to do. We start to, numbers and facts, these things do not reach people. We need new ways to tell the stories about what is happening to our planet right now.
It's tough though. It's tough because everybody is thinking, how am I going to pay my rent? Everybody is thinking of all the stuff that they've got going on in their life and how to manage their relationships and everything that they've got going on. It seems and it feels so insurmountable all the time. It really does.
Yeah. I think that that's another thing, is that we tend to be paralyzed by the enormity of the problems, right? But I think that, and this is one of the things that I was speaking to the students about today, is we really need to reframe things. We need to make them human-sized again. And some of our problems are not actually gigantic. They're actually microscopic. And the example that I gave today is really about, there's a whole section in the book that is about sperm, and it's called the Jizz Biz, which is from a friend who gave me that, Leah, if she's here. And basically, can I just tell a short story? I shared this morning.
I think that's okay.
Okay, yeah. This was something that was on the cutting room floor. It didn't make it into the book. And it's really about how we figured out what sperm was. Because for the longest period of time, when Van Leeuwenhoek was first seeing some of these little, these little swimming cells, people thought they were parasites, right? And it wasn't until a guy named Spallanzani came along, and the reason why we figured out how sperm works is he did a remarkable study where he made little froggy pants, and he put them on frogs, and he made these little hand-sewn pantaloons. And these frogs, he would put these pant-wearing frogs next to some lady frogs. And that is when we came to realize, because the pants were basically like a prophylactic, like a condom, that those pant-wearing frogs were not actually producing progeny. So that was the very first time that human beings realized the power of sperm, which is why Spallanzani is actually the father of artificial insemination. Not intelligence, sorry about that. That is a leap. Artificial insemination. But with artificial insemination now, we've created a world from the tiny where we have over 60 billion domesticated animals on Earth. And today, domesticated animals outnumber wild animals 15-1. This is not a problem that is gigantic in its beginnings. It is a problem that is microscopic in its beginnings. So a lot of the solutions to these problems are actually in our hands. They're not that difficult, but will is what is difficult.
Do we get another pants story?
There are so many of those.
I was just gonna. So what else didn't make the book? Because it's a tremendous amount of research that's in here. There's just so many anecdotes and little stories.
Yeah.
Do you have another little nugget that you want to throw out there?
Well, I will say that some of the stuff that I talked about today is not in the book simply because the one thing that was cut by my editor in the book was the epilogue, which was called Solutions. And my editor said, we don't need that. And I was like, we don't need that? Don't we need that part? That's not the really important part. And he said, no, because you're not trying to do that. You're trying to show people a new way to see the world. It isn't all about, and as I mentioned here today, the solutions are everywhere. We're not lacking solutions. So that is the one part that actually hit the cutting room floor.
Another question, I'm just kind of trying to listen to you and watch Slido at the same time here. And I'm curious as well, who are your biggest influences in media right now? You mentioned that there's our media landscape in Canada does not have enough science discussion, and I agree that that's a huge blind spot, if you will. Who are your other influences that you like?
That are Canadian or just worldwide?
Just anybody.
Oh,
just
okay.
If people are looking for somebody else to kind of consume, if they're interested in this kind of stuff, whether Twitter, books.
Yeah. I love rebellious, call things out thinkers. I like Anand Girandahas. He's been doing some really cool things right now. He's really looking, I think he's got a book called Winner Takes All. I'm plugging his book now, but his is really about how there's this illusion that rich people can change the world, that billionaires are actually all out there trying to help us, as opposed to really maintaining a lot of the societal structures. Philanthropy is good, yes, but he actually unveils a different power structure that is at work in places like Davos, etc. Naomi Klein, obviously, is another great thinker. David Suzuki is another wonderful thinker, and it's really terrific to see that a lot of these pioneering rebel badasses come from Canada.
You'd mentioned earlier, and it just makes me sad thinking about all these kids not talking about the 22nd century. Really great question here from the audience. What does the 22nd century look like to you?
Oh my goodness, that is such a good question. And It's one that I was actually asked by my mentor to write a new book about perhaps this sort of future utopia. But there are so many, I mean, here's an idea that I want to kind of throw at some of you guys. I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I mentioned it earlier today too. And when I was growing up in Hong Kong, we had 7-Eleven, and 7-Eleven was called 7-Eleven because it was open from 7 a.m. till 11 p.m. And only in the 80s did we kind of have capitalism creep into the night. And we started living in a 24-hour world. And I was just thinking how wonderful it would be if we could take back the night in some way. Because I want to be able to look at activism in a way where we can give a gift back to people. So if we can cut a lot of the energy that we use at night, for example, I was kind of inspired by what has happened. I don't know if any of you guys heard this story about Los Angeles. But in the 1990s, they had a blackout in Los Angeles. And all of a sudden, the Griffiths Observatory, the observatory that sits above Sunset, started getting all these phone calls. And all these people started calling in going, what is that big glowing white orb in the sky? And it was because people had never seen the Milky Way. And I know people in New York City who have never seen the stars. And I think that that is a really fair trade. If we can save some of our energy, but give people back the fucking universe, you know what I mean? Like, let's give something back. So we need to be able to think in different ways. Another thing that I think is really wonderful is intergenerational integration. So in terms of a better world, when I think of how isolated and atomized old people are today, there's been a great experiment, but it seems to be working very well, where, for example, with the elderly, they're integrating kindergartens into senior citizens' homes. And that's because little kids are all like, you know, they're always like, why? And your normal adult doesn't have time or patience to deal with kids, but old people will sit there and listen forever. They'll listen, but they're also so engaged, and it brings light and joy to their lives. So why not find solutions that make the world a better place? So those are just two ideas that I have for how we can envision a better world.
Speaking of solutions, the audience is pointing out, you said solutions aren't the problem. Are you worried then that you are preaching to the choir? And what kind of change do we need for the people who may not already see the changes that are needed? What can we do to kind of, is it just a matter of having a conversation with somebody who maybe doesn't recognize that? What do you see as being, instead of a room full of people who already are probably on the same page,
right?
How do we take that the next step?
Well, I think everybody needs to get involved in their own way. So I feel like people who are in the media need to focus on the media. People who are engineers need to focus on engineering, which is rebuilding our world. People who are in the sciences work on whether it's like breaking down the chemicals and plastics and creating new things. But I do think that this idea of the gift, of being able to give something back to people instead of being like the activists who are like, you can't eat this, you can't have this. You know, we need to change that framework for one thing as well.
You mentioned the Matrix, and I feel like you're being really, you're being warm and encouraging and positive, but really you're telling us that we're all sheeple. I feel like the theme of this book is that we're all being sheeple, and that it's one of those things that you have to do it gently, because nobody likes being, you know, pointed out that they're not really seeing things the way they are. And at the same time, we don't want to ruin the ending for this book for people who haven't seen it, but there is a type of call to action here. So how do we stop being sheeple? How do we become Neo? And how do we, like, give us a few ideas just kind of in our day-to-day lives, and then just kind of bigger picture what we can do to start bursting this reality bubble.
Yeah, I think that every single person here, I hope, finds just one way to either transform their day-to-day work so that it is, you know, transformative and activist work, and if not, that they actually get engaged. And getting engaged, you have to actually find something that you love. You know, whether it is gardening or whether it is, you know, being a little bit more radical like the folks at the Extinction Rebellion who are going out there and actively shaking up and waking people up. There are many, many different ways of doing these things. And of course, primarily, we need to look at our life support system, how we handle our food and our energy and our waste. And, You know, for me, you asked earlier, have I made personal changes? Yes, I absolutely have. But I also know that they're quite difficult because a lot of people are very stuck in their minds. And, you know, you saw some of the, you know, there are some quotes about how difficult it is for people to change their way of thinking. But I think that once they realize that it's a benefit, it's a win-win to them as well. Especially, for example, I was watching with my parents a story about meat, and we watched Game Changers the other day. So perhaps the way isn't just to say that food is bad for you, or, you know, eating slaughterhouse food is not necessarily a good thing, but maybe once you actually look at some of the best athletes in the world and you have something to aspire to, then that gives you more of a reason to change.
But I'm also reminded, do you remember those commercials that it was like the lady was cooking for her husband and he was like, I'm not gonna eat that stupid pasta that's got cauliflower in it or whatever, and she kind of smiles because he was already eating it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes it's those little changes. It's saying, you know what, I don't need to have meat in my sandwich today, and just like meatless Mondays, or just, I feel like part of this massive problem is people are taking these little bite-sized solutions, saying, I don't want to buy something with disposable packaging. I'm going to just buy 3 apples, and you know what? I'll fish them out of my basket, and you can put them on there, so I don't need a bag. Do you think that there's also something to be said for those little baby steps so that we're eating the healthy pasta without realizing it?
I think that there's something little to be said about some of those little baby steps. There's the personal that's political, but there's a much larger political framework and a system-wide framework that we need to change too. That's why I'm so interested in engineers, because they are actually the builders of our world. But when we take a look at something like the food system, I was quite inspired by something that Josh Tetrick said. And Josh Tetrick, he has a company called Just Eggs. I don't mean to plug it, but I mean, they've been turning mung beans into scrambled eggs so that we don't have these factory farmed chickens that, you know, with these crazy overgrown breasts that are like, you know, cooking over and dying all the time. And so he's looking at food in a different way. And he says the food system isn't completely broken, it is half broken, which means that it is half okay, you know, and we have all the ways. We're a very complex modern society. So it's important that we're able to keep food, refrigerate food, transport food, all those sorts of things, and we have that in place. But at the other end of the scale here, we have a really damaged protein system. So what happens if we change the protein? What happens if we keep all this way of actually transporting food so that we don't have to break everything, is essentially what I'm saying.
Pivoting from something that it does feel like we can make small changes to something that, to me, I really struggle with, and that is technology. The latter part of the book really talks about how we don't even realize how much we are surveilled. We don't even realize how much of our information is being collected, collated, going to whom. It's not just advertising, it's monitoring the population. That almost seems to be harder to break out of than deciding what goes in your body, because it just seems like we have no agency over that. What are your thoughts I know that that's another huge question and we've only got a few minutes left here, but what can we do about that?
Well, I think that that's one of the critical things. And surveillance, we talked about earlier, there are cameras everywhere except where our food comes from, where our energy comes from, and where our waste goes. And there are eyes everywhere, and there's a reason why there are eyes everywhere. It's a lot like Jeremy Bentham. These eyes are what keep us trapped in this invisible prison. If you're ever wondering why we're all, you know, getting up and marching to this drumbeat of eat, sleep, shop, repeat, it is because we're actually trained, as you say, like this sheeple analogy, to really process the everyday world in a very mundane but calculated way. So as we're continuously watched, I think it becomes very dangerous. I think we're seeing systems like the social credit system take place in China, where you are rewarded and punished based on your data. And we have to be very, very careful that that doesn't happen. And you know, there are a lot of different privacy advocate organizations here in Canada to make sure that that doesn't seep its way in. So it's critical that we do that. And I think that that's one of the key chapters that, that we need to pay attention to, because that's where we can start to make some change. We need to start to free ourselves. Because if you look at, for example, America, land of the free, right? The land of the free is the land right now that is building fences, building walls, and it has the largest incarcerated population on earth. We have to really pay attention to the rhetoric that these notions of freedom, because they're actually lies. They're imprisoning us.
And I think at the end of the day, the power that these companies have over us is because there are so many of us. And I think when we do start to push back against that, these concerns around privacy and Facebook, it has resulted in some changes in legislation in Canada, particularly around the election advertising laws and that kind of thing. I think there are some signs out there that pushing back and having some sort of response is making a difference. I mean, the Beyond Meat, if anybody's bought their stock, I think you're doing pretty well these days.
Yeah,
and I think it just shows you the power of the consumer, that we may be a bunch of little people, but when an idea does start to take hold, we are starting to see those differences in all sorts of avenues.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, right? So, I mean, you have enough people who are starting to see that the plant-based world actually makes sense, and, you know, more and more consumers have actually created an entire industry that previously didn't exist before. All of Vancouver, the whole restaurant industry here has largely changed, and people are benefiting from it as well. So, yeah, definitely win-win there.
Here's a really forward-thinking question. What are the ways that individuals, especially those of the incoming younger generation, can inspire the shifting of thinking to peers and those across generations?
How can young people shift? I think that they're already doing it in the best way possible, honest to God. When I saw 7 million young people marching, when I see a young woman like Greta Thunberg who is able to speak the truth, and that's the thing about all of us. I think we recognize the truth when we see it, and it resonates with all of us. And it's the ability to cut through a lot of bullshit that actually shakes up the action and gets us to be re-engaged. And so I'm already tremendously happy that young people are not, I don't want them to blow up another reality bubble. I think that that's the key thing. And one of the key ways, especially a place like UBC, is to not keep passing that reality bubble on and on to other generations.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like my eyes have been opened a lot here tonight. So I thank you so much for this, Ziya. This discussion has been incredible. Everybody,
thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. I also want to thank everybody for joining us in person and on the live stream, and for spending some time with us this evening. Ziya is going to be in the lobby signing books, but as you can see, it's basically a full house in here. So we're gonna, in order for everybody to get their book signed, please no selfies, don't ask her for personalized messages. I know that's what makes it special because you were here, but there is just...
I'll do a few.
I'll do a few, okay, I'm reading off the script here. I'm trying to be a good host. And one last request, since you've all got smartphones in hand, I can see the glow in some glasses out here. I know that they're out there. The UBC Connects team is just asking that you can just review tonight's session, give us your feedback on Slido, click on the polling tab, just to answer a couple of questions about your experience tonight. And so for those of you joining us for the reception, we invite you to make your way to the lobby, and for everybody else, have a safe travel home.
Vancouver, I'm so grateful. Thank you.